Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk about the other line of fighters in Britain's arsenal in World War II, the line that sat in the shadow of the Supermarine Spitfire, but was just as important, if not more important in some respects, in Hawker's line of fighters, from the Hurricane to the Tornado to the Typhoon. It's not terribly surprising that the Spitfire ended up outshining the Hawker line, since the Spitfire was more of a dogfighter than the Hawker line was, and air-to-air combat gets a lot more attention and praise than air-to-ground combat. You know, we hear about pilots that become aces by taking down numerous enemy aircraft, but you don't hear nearly as much about the aces that take out trains and trucks and encampments and stuff like that. But those pilots and those planes do play an incredibly vital role in combat. Now, to be fair to the Hawker line, they certainly weren't slouches when it came to air-to-air combat, and the Hurricane was arguably more important and prevalent in the Battle of Britain, but the Spitfire was just more sexy, so to speak. But over on the Hawker line, while the Hurricane would be produced up until 1944, all the way back in 1937, the year that the Hurricane was introduced, Hawker went about creating its successor, using two prospective 24-cylinder inline engines that were designed to output over 2,000 horsepower. Hawker began two competing projects in the Type N and Type R, which used the Napier Sabre and the Rolls-Royce Vulture, respectively. The Type R project, later receiving the name of Tornado, that one was the loser of the two, and you can learn more about that design in this video. And the Type N, later renamed the Typhoon, was the victor, but even then its victory was honestly kind of disappointing. Intended to serve more as an interceptor, the Typhoon was initially plagued by engine and just various developmental issues that made the initial models not perform all that well, and as a result they suffered. It was quickly discovered that the Typhoon would not be viable as an interceptor, owing to its poor climb rate and overall poor performance at high altitudes, but seemingly as a trade-off, the Typhoon performed quite well at low altitudes. In fact, it performed better than quite well. It was arguably one of the best low-altitude aircraft in the entire war. Because of how well it performed here, it was decided to completely shift its role from being a primary fighter and interceptor to more of a fighter-bomber, and for the rest of its service in World War II, armed with upwards of 1,000 pounds of bombs, rockets, and its 420mm cannons, the Typhoon was a powerhouse of a low-altitude attacker, able to take out ground targets and low-flying air targets with relative ease. But still, the Typhoon's poor high-altitude performance did leave room for improvement, and Hawker would go about trying to make a version of the Typhoon that could actually serve at higher altitudes, or at the very least they wanted to make a better version of the Typhoon. What Hawker ended up making was the fastest and arguably the best low-altitude fighter of World War II. This is the Hawker Tempest. Its story begins in the early 1940s, with Hawker already internally looking to improve upon the Typhoon design. Even though at this stage the Typhoon was very early in its development, designer Sidney Cam and his team believed that its prospective performance could be improved by reworking its wing, to be thinner and a bit closer to the wing of the Spitfire. Not a carbon copy of the Spitfire's wing, just a little bit closer to how it looked. Additionally, to improve the aerodynamics, the large, open-mouth-looking chin radiator was to be removed and replaced with a more hidden and streamlined pair of radiators that was buried in the leading edge of the wing roots. This would make the new design's nose look more similar to the nose of the Hurricane, and it was hoped that this, along with the wing alteration, would help to boost high-altitude performance. This alteration did come with a caveat, though. In the Typhoon, extra fuel tanks were located in the wings towards the leading edges, where those radiators would now be. Plus, with the wings being thinner, there just wasn't any room in them for fuel tanks, and so the new wings would necessarily lead to a reduced fuel capacity and reduced range. This would be made up for, though, with a slight extension in the fuselage and the addition of another fuel tank in that extension. Hawker would present this design alteration to the Air Ministry in November 1941, under their internal designation of Hawker P-1012, and in response the Air Ministry issued specification F-1041, and the project aircraft received the name of Typhoon II, and 2 prototypes of them were ordered. However, because the proposed modifications altered the plane's design a pretty decent amount, the Air Ministry decided in August 1942 that these proposed alterations warranted a new name, and the Typhoon II was given its own unique name of Tempest. By this time as well, due to the progress of the original Typhoon project, the Tempest project would now be slightly reworked, and more prototypes would be ordered. With the failure of the Hawker Tornado, the Air Ministry decided that they wanted Hawker to test out this new design with different engines. In what would be the Tempest 1 and 5, they would be powered by different versions of the Napier Sabre. The 1 model would have the new radiator system, and the 5 would have the older chin radiator that the Typhoon had. The Tempest 2 would use a radial Bristol Centaurus engine, and the Tempest 3 and 4, they would use different versions of the Rolls-Royce Griffin. While kinda the whole point of the redesign was to remove the chin radiator and move them into the wings, the first Tempest that took to the air looked strikingly similar to just a Hawker Typhoon. Indeed, the Mark V Tempest was the first to take to the air on September 2nd, 1942, powered by a Napier Sabre II engine. The Mark I version was currently stuck in development, as the version of the Sabre engine it was supposed to use in the Sabre IV was suffering from developmental issues and wasn't ready to take to the air. This initial model Tempest, measuring in at 10.26 meters long, 12.5 meters wide, and 4.25 meters tall, it was very similar to the Typhoon, but it was about half a meter longer, and the wingspan was about a fifth of a meter less, these owing to the slight fuselage extension for the fuel tank and the redesigned wing, respectively. Other than that, along with a slight alteration in the cannon armament placement, the Tempest basically just looked like the Typhoon. Notably, the cockpit canopy looked exactly the same, and the tail surfaces stayed the same as well, so when viewed from the side, it would be very difficult to tell the Tempest and the Typhoon apart. Shortly after its first flight, though, the Tempest would see some alterations that helped to visually distinguish it from the Typhoon. The cockpit canopy was altered to be more of a high-vision bubble style, for pilot comfort and ease of use, and the tail surfaces would be reworked as well. Due to the extension in the fuselage, the initial Tempest suffered a bit early on in the whole stability department, and so the tail surfaces had to be enlarged, and the vertical surface in particular was given an extended dorsal section. While I couldn't find information on the exact performance of the Tempest in these early stages, it was at least noted to be better than the Typhoon, with greater speed and maneuverability. However, likely due to development issues with the Sabre engine that haunted both the Tempest and the Typhoon, along with the fact that the Mark V Tempest was actually considered to be more of a backup option to the Mark I, the Air Ministry and Hawker didn't seem to be in a major rush to bring the Mark V Tempest into production. By early 1943, production lines for the Tempest V would be made, and production started, albeit very slowly, in mid-1943. While that initial line was being established, on February 24, 1943, the Tempest I with the modified radiators would take to the air, and its performance showed that in this configuration, Britain had something pretty interesting on their hands. Powered by the still troublesome Sabre 4 engine, the Tempest I reached an amazing top speed of 466 miles an hour at 24,500 feet. With this kind of speed, the Tempest I would rocket right to the top of the list of the fastest piston engine combat planes in the world, and it kinda seemed like they were right in slow-rolling the Tempest V, as the Tempest I would almost certainly be overtaking it. Unfortunately, though, it simply wasn't meant to be, and the problems with the Sabre 4 engine would never be remedied. And without the specific Sabre 4 engine, the Tempest I and its amazing performance would never advance out of the prototype phase. Also not advancing out of the prototype phase would be the Tempest 3 and 4, to be powered by the Rolls-Royce Griffon. So this left just the Tempest V and the Tempest II, and the Tempest II didn't take to the air until June 28, 1943, a week after the first production model Tempest V rolled off the line. Shortly after the first Tempest V rolled out, the third production model of it took to the air and gave us some performance data. While it wasn't as fast as the Tempest I, it was still pretty fast, sitting somewhere between 426 and 435 miles an hour at around 18,000 feet. And like the Typhoon, it performed exceptionally well at low altitudes, sitting at 376 miles an hour at sea level and 411 at 6,600 feet. Missing now was the desired high-altitude performance that spurred the project in the first place, but at the very least they ended up with a solid improvement over the Typhoon. But interestingly enough, the Tempest II was actually even better. Wanting to outfit a fighter with the Bristol Centaurus radial engine, initial efforts to do so back in late 1941 amounted to a relatively promising but also problematic aircraft, fit to a Hawker Tornado. While the engine was certainly powerful, they struggled to adequately cool it, and the engine constantly ran very hot, teetering on the edge of overheating. So when the Tornado project eventually got cancelled, the effort to power a fighter with the Centaurus was transferred over to the Tempest project, and luckily for Hawker, by this time, they had acquired a very important piece of technology. Britain had captured a German Focke-Wulf FW-190, and in their examination of it, they discovered that their method of cooling the FW-190's radial engine was more efficient and effective, allowing both for a tighter cowling around the engine and better cooling of the engine. This knowledge gained meant that when the Tempest II took to the air on June 28, 1943, its nose looked remarkably similar to the FW-190, almost as if they had just cut the nose off an FW-190 and threw it onto a Typhoon frame. Even though they did learn from one of the best fighters of the World War II era, the Tempest II wasn't great off the bat, as it did suffer from engine vibration issues. These issues were, well, they weren't quickly remedied, but they were eventually remedied by altering the engine mount to have some shock absorbers. Performance-wise, though, once the vibration issues were out of the way, the Tempest II was better than the Tempest V, hitting top speeds of 440 miles an hour at 15,200 feet. The II was slightly faster, and with a climb to that altitude that took just 4.5 minutes, It was 30 seconds faster than the 5, and with a service ceiling that was about 1,000 feet more than the 5, sitting at 37,500 feet, the Tempest II had a little bit more versatility, and the pilots also noted that the 2's engine sounded quieter from the cockpit, making it more comfortable and pleasurable to fly. Yet, even with the better performance and the more pleasant flying experience, the Tempest II ended up playing second fiddle to the Tempest V, and when production of the Tempest ceased, the 5 outnumbered the 2 by a ratio of 2-to-1. This was at least partially due to the production and development of the 5 starting earlier than the 2, but it was also due to logistical issues and the end of World War II. Hawker wasn't actually meant to be the primary producer of the Tempest II. That honor initially went to Gloucester, but Gloucester was preoccupied by production of both the Hawker Typhoon and their own Gloucester Meteor jet fighter project. This forced the contract to be shifted over to Bristol, who then had to establish production lines, and that took quite a bit of time. It wouldn't be until October 4th, 1944, that the first Bristol-made production model Tempest II rolled off the line, and anywhere from just 3 dozen to 50 aircraft were made by Bristol before the end of the war, resulted in the production contract being altered and shifted back over to Hawker. Past the 5 and the 2, the last Tempest variant, the Tempest VI, it was largely just a Tempest V that had a slightly stronger engine and a slightly modified cooling system that saw the return of the wing root leading edge air intakes specifically for the carburetor. Other modifications to the 6 consisted of small structural improvements to the plane and the plane being tropicalized, being fit with some air filters to keep sand and debris out of the vital components. Ultimately, across the 3 major variants, just under 1,400 Tempests were ever made. About 800 were the 5, about 400 were the 2, and about 150 or so were the 6. But with the excellent flight performance of all 3 Tempest variants, when the 5 specifically started seeing service in World War II in early to mid-1944, they would certainly be an incredible weapon for the Royal Air Force, being able to go toe-to-toe with any German or Axis fighter in existence. But largely, at least initially, it wasn't against traditional fighters that the Tempest made its initial mark, but rather against the German superweapon that was the V-1 rocket. These unmanned rockets, flying upwards of 400 miles an hour at low altitudes, presented a pretty serious problem. If nothing else, they would be a massive weight on the shoulders of the British populace, having to be constantly on alert not only for traditional bombers, but now these rockets raining down on their homes. While these rockets wouldn't be able to fly evasive maneuvers against British fighters, their sheer low-altitude speed meant that it would be very difficult for most fighters to keep pace with them. But with the Tempest appearing on the scene, around the time that the V-1 started to be used, Britain had the perfect plane to defend Britain. Flying at or above 400 miles an hour at the same altitude, the Tempest was able to keep pace with the V-1s, and Tempest pilots would develop a strategy to ensure destruction of the V-1s. They would start by flying lower than the rockets, slowly making their way up into the rocket's exhaust or slipstream. The pilot would then aim for the bright light of the rocket's pulse jet engine and fire a short burst of its 20mm cannons, very easily destroying them. Flying these defensive missions alongside planes like the de Havilland Mosquito, the P-51 Mustang, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and late war variant Spitfires, a real who's who of World War II legends, the Tempest ended the war as the most effective V-1 destroyer, taking out somewhere between 638 and 800 V-1s, with the Mosquito a close second at 623, and the other planes all combining for the remaining 600 or so. Going past V-1 rocket defense duty, in air-to-air combat against actual manned aircraft, the Tempest reportedly had a roughly 8-to-1 kill-death ratio, taking down around 240 enemy aircraft for around 30 lost. These losses do not include, though, losses incurred from ground attack duties, where the Tempest served quite well, but also inevitably lost many more aircraft, at least 31 in February 1945 alone. This wasn't due to any inherent flaw in the design, but rather just the nature of low-altitude combat and Germany's defenses. Flak and other ground fire would inevitably damage and destroy aircraft. There would be situations where German aircraft outnumbered Allied ones, and there would be accidents. A notable accident, or accidents plural, was the fact that many American pilots weren't actually familiar with the Tempest and sometimes mistook them for enemy aircraft, and at least a handful of Tempests were shot down by friendly air and ground forces. But the Tempest's exceptional low-altitude performance also made it very valuable against some other German superweapons, notably in the HE-162 People's Fighter that could hit speeds upwards of 520 miles an hour, and the ME-262 jet fighter that could hit upwards of 560 miles an hour. The Tempest became the first fighter to shoot down an HE-162 on April 19, 1945, and they were also able to take out a number of ME-262s and AR-234s. In effect, the Tempest gave Britain a solid weapon in this late war sort of intermediary period between the end of the propeller age and the start of the jet age, with the Tempest being better than most other propeller-powered aircraft at the time, and also better than a lot of early jet aircraft as well. Ultimately, though, the Tempest was this powerful, fast, agile, sort of ultimate form of the Hurricane that was quite effective, especially against Germany's late-war superweapons. But seemingly as the fate of the entire Hawker fighter-bomber line was, both it and its brethren were kind of relegated to being second fiddle to the Spitfire, at least in the perception of the public. And at least in the Tempest's, and probably the Typhoon's case as well, this was likely at least partially due to their late arrival and late maturation. But regardless, the Tempest should nevertheless be remembered fondly as one of the best low-altitude fighters of World War II, dominating both the ground and slightly above the ground in the final years. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. So, I started playing the game Subnautica again recently. If you've never played Subnautica, I guess you can picture it like Minecraft, but underwater. I love the game. It's great, actually. But it's also kind of one of the scariest games I've ever played, unironically. Normal scary games do give you jump scares, and they do make me jump, because that's the point, but Subnautica's like the only game that gives me anxiety, because I hate deep water, and specifically water where you can't see the bottom of it. And Subnautica has that, and some sea monsters that go with it. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.